Chapter 3 of Tractate Bechoros discusses the doubtful firstborn tithe. The first Mishnah says, if somebody buys an animal from a non-Jewish man and doesn't know whether or not it ever had a firstborn child before, Rabbi Yishmael says, if the animal is a goat, if it had a child within her first year, that's definitely given to the Kohen. Afterwards, the animal has a doubtful status. If the animal was a ewe, if it has a child within 2 years, that's definitely given to a Kohen. Afterwards, the animal has a doubtful status. And if it was a cow or a donkey, then animals born during the first 3 years go to the Kohen, and afterwards they're in doubt. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says that if an animal has ever had a miscarriage, then all future births are exempt from the firstborn tithes, and it describes a miscarriage. So if the animal didn't have a miscarriage, then its firstborn is firstborn. But if it did have a miscarriage, then anything born after is exempt from this. And if there's a case of doubt, the offerings afterwards should just be eaten once they get a blemish. The Gemara says, regarding the waiting for the animal's years of children, this possibly means we reject the opinion that we follow the majority of cases, that most animals have offspring in their first year. This is based on a related principle by the laws of the Levirate marriage, where most opinions rule that it's forbidden for a minor to perform yibum or chalitza, as there's a concern for a minority that they'll have some physical defect that will then retroactively invalidate this marriage. Or it's just unique that we do follow the opinion that we follow the majority, it's just that it's only done when the majority is not contingent on performing an action. There are further quoted opinions on the status of these purchased animals. Some say it goes by the year they gave birth, and some say there's exemption if they had miscarried prior. This latter opinion is either only concerned for a minority case where it results in astringency, or it's just that they disagree as to whether a goat that miscarried in its first year and if it can then have a second child in that first year. The second opinion says that's physically possible, which is why it's exempt. This opinion disagrees with a very similar one on some small details, as he says if a goat miscarried within 6 months, she can still have a viable child within her year. This could be like what if the goat miscarried at the very end of its 6-month limit, as to whether a miscarriage could be shorter than 30 days to allow another child to be born within that month. Alternatively, the disagreement is on whether the animal can have viable children if the gestation period was for less than 5 months, or just that they dispute whether part of a day is considered to be a full day, as to whether if the miscarriage is on the last possible day of the 6 months, if it's still possible to have a second child within the first year. Then there was Rabbi Akiva's opinion, and he essentially holds that if an animal produces milk, that doesn't strictly mean it's had its firstborn, here a miscarriage, and anything born after is invalid, so it puts future offerings in that questionable status. It suggests another case by laws of tithes. If a goat gives birth to 3 daughters and each of those gave birth within the first year, they all must be tithed from. It listed a case with 10 goats to create a tithing obligation, but it mentioned each animal having their own offspring, as we rule that a goat that has a viable child in 1 year cannot have another that same year. Now, there was a second opinion who mentioned this case, but that it only applies if the animals were all tithed within 1 year. There's the same explanations as before as to what the difference is, either they dispute whether a goat that miscarried can have another child within 30 days, whether an animal that gestates for less than 5 months is considered to be viable, or whether part of a day is considered to be a full day, or they debate whether a premature animal can even be tithed. It further proves that it is held by some opinions that a premature animal can be tithed from. We've been mentioning miscarriages of a specific sort where there was just a fluid discharge, and it additionally describes what this looks like. It said that for an embryo to form in a human womb, it takes 40 days. By an animal, the length of time is unresolved. Anyways, this was all regarding a Jewish man purchasing an animal from a non-Jewish man, thereby causing a doubtful status on the firstborn. If it was purchased from a Jewish man, it's considered to definitely have had a firstborn, as if it had children that would have definitely been mentioned in the sale, as it's a good thing typically. Others disagree and say it'd have a doubtful status, as they might just not mention whether or not it had children because they think the animal is just being sold to be eaten as meat. Others say it's just definitely not a bechor, as if it was, it'd be prohibited to benefit from, and the seller would have definitely told him that that was a factor, which it then sources. The earlier opinions just held that a man has no responsibility to alert a buyer as to whether an animal had offspring or not. New Mishnah. Some opinions say, if a large animal discharges a large amount of blood, that must be buried, and it's exempt from the firstborn tithe. The Gemara adds, this blood wouldn't transmit impurity through contact or carrying. The reason it's therefore buried is just to show that the mother is henceforth exempt from the Bechor tithe. It doesn't transmit impurity as it's a fetus, as it's nullified by the majority of other fluids it's mixed with, as seen in some other cases. Some say a miscarried child is not considered to have opened the womb as a firstborn, unless its head circumference is the size of a spindle whorl. It additionally describes similar principles. Related to this, it said if somebody has fish brine that's impure, he can purify it by taking it into a mikveh. As if this brine is majority water, then it'll just be purified by the mikveh water. And if it's majority brine, then it can't become impure, as the water is nullified. Although if it's then cooked in a pot, the impure water will mix with the pot water and become impure. And it mentions similar nullifications of produce by other foods. Some actually hold that nullified impurities cannot actually be reawakened by mixing them with other produce. This is discussed from several cases, which finally brings us to our own case. An animal miscarried a large amount of blood. We said it doesn't give off impurity, as the fetus is nullified through all of the fluids. So in fact, based on this opinion that said nullified impurities can be reawakened just can't fit with our Mishnah. Although some try to say here, if a dead animal was putrefied from its very beginning, it doesn't give off impurity. Although it said that this wouldn't strictly apply here, as the blood mass was technically fit for consumption initially if its mother had been eaten before it had been expelled. Related, it said that if pure brine mixes with a small amount of water, it's considered to be impure, as it was originally owned by an ignoramus who are suspect of diluting their brine with up to an equal amount of water. Or it's just that it was exactly 50% of water and it was then mixed with a small amount of water, so it becomes majority water, which is then susceptible to rabbinic impurity. New Mishnah. Some say if somebody purchases a nursing animal from a non-Jewish man, we assume that the nursing animal is nursing from its own actual mother. Similarly, if their entire flock is viewed and they see that animals that had given birth were nursing and animals that hadn't given birth were not nursing, we can assume that every animal is just nursing with its own child. The Bechoros says an opinion that every Mishnah stated in this particular chapter is the law we hold like. Issue is, nearly every Mishnah in this chapter contains a dispute, so it explains he could only be referring to Mishnahs that don't contain a dispute, meaning including this Mishnah and the next one after this, in spite of the fact that its points are disputed outside of the actual Mishnah. It quotes the opinions that disagree with the statements listed here, that we don't assume an animal is nursing with its own child. Anyways, it further disputes as to whether we can viably assume an animal always nurses its own young. Related, if somebody saw a young pig nursing from a ewe, the ewe is exempt from the Bechor tithe and the pig cannot be eaten as it's not kosher. This is essentially as we apparently hold, that we assume it's only nursing with its own offspring, and if it had a child already, it might nurse with other animals of its own type, but not animals of a different species, unless it itself had given birth to them. This is similarly questioned by other opinions. New Mishnah. Now, as there's a prohibition against shearing the wool of a Bechor firstborn animal, some say if somebody wants to slaughter such an animal and they need to clear away hair from the area of slaughter, it's allowed to part the hair to either side or even to pluck out individual hairs so long as they're left in place. This also applies if somebody's searching an area for a blemish. The Gemara says, as mentioned earlier, this is an undisputed Mishnah in this chapter, so we follow this opinion. Related, if somebody wants to slaughter an animal on a holiday, it's asked if he's allowed to pluck hair to make room for the knife, essentially as to whether this constitutes as an act of shearing. As if it does and it's allowed, it's because the intent isn't to actually remove the hair, it's just to clear the area to slaughter it, which would be allowed on a holiday. It said that this would actually be allowed on a holiday, although it does additionally dispute whether we rule of doing a prohibited act on a holiday without it being your direct intent is prohibited or not. Also, it said that plucking a feather is different than pulling out hair, as there's liability for doing so. It discusses by other laws of the red heifer cow, where it said it's allowed to trim any hair there that is black, although that's possibly unique as it's uncommon, or it's just that he holds that plucking the hair is not the same as shearing the hair, and he also holds that something unintended is forbidden. Anyways, by the slaughtering of the Bechor animal, the hair must only be removed by hand. If the hair is being cleared to inspect a blemish, it proves and concludes that this is permitted to be done even initially. New Mishnah. By hair or wool from a blemished Bechor tithe that fell out and was tucked away for safekeeping, and the Bechor was then slaughtered, is a dispute if the wool can then be permitted for benefit. Some say the dispute is where hair of a blemished Bechor fell out and then the animal just died. That's where the dispute exists, if it could be benefited from. If wool on a Bechor is detached from the hide but is dangling from the fleece after the animal is slaughtered, anything that's viewed as part of the fleece is allowed, otherwise it's prohibited. The Gemara says, according to the second interpretation of the dispute in the Mishnah, they would agree in the first case where the animal was slaughtered that it's agreed that the animal wool is permitted. Some interpret the entire case to be where an expert has determined that the animal was blemished and that the Bechor was permitted for use, while others dispute this and discuss further. Some say that simply nobody permits wool of a Bechor that was detached before the animal's blemish was confirmed, although again this is disputed by others, so there's essentially about 6 varying opinions between these cases of a Bechor that was slaughtered or if it died, as to if the wool could be saved and then benefited from, although it was stated in the earlier Tractate Edios that if hair of a blemished firstborn animal fell out and was kept, and then the Bechor was slaughtered, the dispute exists, meaning the dispute exists where the Bechor was slaughtered, according to one of those listed opinions. This is further supported. If wool unintentionally becomes detached from an Ola offering, unlike by sin offerings which aren't postponed, this is still brought for atonement, so that's disputed, and it argues if it'll actually be postponed. So we note if somebody plucks wool from an unblemished Bechor offering, if a blemish later develops and it's slaughtered, the plucked wool would be prohibited. This would imply that if the wool naturally fell out, it would be permitted, and the same would apply by an Ola offering, which somebody would not postpone bringing as it atones But this is rejected, as it says that even if the wool naturally fell out, it would be also impermissible, which shows us the stringency of this opinion. Lastly, we said if wool dangles from a fleece that's then slaughtered, the wool that's not seen as part of the fleece is forbidden. So this is defined as either wool where the root and tip are both visible from above, or just any wool that's not level with the other wool. And the first opinion disagrees with the second, as he just says that all fleeces have some hairs that aren't level. And that's the end of chapter 3.